What role did the RAAF play in the Battle of Ishirava and the retreat to Port Moresby? We look at the RAAF support to operations during the Kokoda Campaign.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 116 of the Principles of War podcast. This is the fourth episode looking at No. 75 Squadron and its 44-day deployment to Port Moresby. It's the 18th episode of this series looking at the Battle of Ishirava and in particular the 53rd Battalion, one of the militia battalions that was deployed up the Kokoda track. We've looked at the mistakes that were made in mobilisation in the way that we raised, trained and sustained the militia battalions as they fought on the Kokoda track. In fact, some of those mistakes were also applied to the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th battalions with grave impact. We've looked at how No. 75 Squadron was formed, how it was trained, and how it fought in Port Moresby. And we see a rhyming between the mistakes that were made with the battalions on the track and the squadrons in the air. Today we pick up the story just after the tragic death of John Jackson on the 28th of April, 1942. He is replaced as commanding officer by his brother, Les Jackson. And so we're going to start off with a look at the leadership style of Les. I want to be upfront, we're going to be covering some fairly dark material in this podcast. But it's important to recognise that we're not doing this for the voyeuristic nature of it. We're doing it because of the importance of the role. It is very important that we look at the way that officers are prepared for the challenges and tribulations of commanding soldiers, airmen or sailors. And when we are selecting someone for this responsibility and privilege, there should be a fairly well-stacked bench of potential candidates. After we look at Les's leadership style, we're going to look at the last days of 75 Squadron in Port Moresby. We'll then look at the Battle of Milne Bay and what the RAAF did there. Milne Bay and Ishirava were being fought at the same time, and air power was described as the decisive factor by Lieutenant General Sid Rowell. We'll then finish up with an analysis of air power and its contribution to the Kokoda Campaign. So let's start having a look at Les Jackson. At this stage of the war, Les Jackson has already had a short stint as the CO of No. 75 Squadron. He'd taken over command of the squadron after his brother had gone missing. There's no doubt whatsoever about his courage as a fighter pilot. He was the first RAAF ace in the Pacific War, so the first pilot to be able to down 5 enemy planes, for which he was awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross, and 2 years later he would get a bar to his DFC. Both of them had been awarded for great courage under fire. Les was 9 years younger than his brother John, and had followed John into the Air Reserve in 1937. He was a great friend if you were on his right side. He certainly liked to drink. He's been described as quite divisive. For all of his flaws, I haven't seen anywhere that he was desperate for a command position. I think he would have been quite happy just flying and fighting and destroying Japanese aircraft. But with the death of his brother, there was no one to take command of the squadron. I do think that it's really important that we point out the fact that his brother, his older brother, has just died, and Les identified the body by the foot that was left in the shoe. That was all that was left of his brother. Only 4 people attended the funeral of John Jackson. Les, the doctor, Dean Butcher, and the 2 wing commanders, Pierce and Gibson. They are the ones who were concerned that there wasn't enough aggression within No. 75 Squadron, and they were the ones who wanted John Jackson to alter the tactics of the squadron from the dive and zoom to the dogfighting tactics, a tactic that was clearly unsuitable in 0 versus P40 combat. So psychologically, I think it's very fair to say that Les Jackson probably was not in a good place. The death of a brother, an older brother, would always take a psychological toll. The manner in which it occurred and Les's personal involvement in it certainly would have created a very difficult time for Les. As he is going through all of this, he is thrust into the responsibility of commanding the squadron. We'll start with the thoughts of Flight Lieutenant Bill Dean Butcher, the Doctor of Number 75 Squadron. This is an interview that was conducted with him by Peter Broun.
What are your impressions of Les Jackson?
Les Jackson was, I think, a competent pilot and a very brave man. He was appointed to command at very short notice, and he was ill-equipped for the appointment. He was young, he was overshadowed by a big brother who was the commanding officer. I think as a leader in the air he was good. On the ground he was hopeless, and he didn't improve. His personal habits were not really acceptable from the point of view of someone who's commanding men. You know what I mean by that. I wouldn't want to be quoted as saying too much more than that. He has a family. He's dead now, but he did become a pretty bad drunk in due course. And even during his service years, he held the appointment of command, and he was awarded a DFC for his flying, but he was never a man who could really capture the leadership qualities which one would hope to have.
I've just had another listen to the second interview that I was going to put into the podcast. I've decided not to. I don't think there's a lot to be gained by it. I think Bill Dean Butcher's words clearly paint a picture of someone who may not have been fit for command at that time and potentially further later in the war. So I won't put that in, but what I will do is I'll cover just one of the anecdotes which is covered in Michael Veitch's book, 44 Days. There's a series of anecdotes about Les in the book. This one I think is quite telling. This incident occurred on the 1st of May, less than half a week after the death of John Jackson. A new pilot, Sergeant Don Munro, had flown up from Townsville as a reinforcement. Sergeant Munro was surprised at the lack of discussion about tactics in the air and how they should be aiming to defeat the Japanese. He probably would have been expecting the senior pilots to be imparting their wisdom and their experience in the mess to the junior pilots so that they could have the best chance against the Japanese, who, it's important to remember, have extensive combat experience. He raised his concerns with Les Jackson in the mess on the 1st of May. Les replied, "Shut up, Munro. You'll be pushing up the daisies by this time tomorrow." Sergeant Munro had been rostered to fly the next day with Bob Crawford and Alan Wetters. That morning, Munro was flying as Crawford's wingman. They'd just engaged a flight of 30s when they were bounced from behind and above. Crawford shoved everything into the corner and bunted away aggressively. Munro, on his first combat mission, wasn't fast enough. His plane was seen to be burning and on fire. Many of the pilots couldn't see the value in putting a rookie pilot up on a combat flight when there were plenty of more experienced pilots who were available. The big picture issue with 75 Squadron at this time is the fact that there's no succession planning for someone to take over the squadron should John Jackson be killed. There are plenty of indications that Les was a very courageous pilot, quite talented, however, not a great leader of a squadron. And this comes back to the two important questions. What training had he been given at this stage in his career to enable him to be the leader of a squadron? And who were the alternatives? Was there competition for the role so that Number 75 Squadron could get the very best commanding officer that it could? This clearly wasn't the case. At almost the same time, one of the new pilots, Sergeant West, crashes on takeoff, destroying another of the serviceable aircraft that the squadron had, one of the very few that they had left, and almost kills himself in the process. The end of the deployment for Number 75 Squadron to Port Moresby is drawing near. On the 5th of May, Les Jackson is officially made the CEO of Number 75 Squadron, and shortly after that, he is informed that the Japanese invasion fleet is heading for Port Moresby. Les addresses the squadron and tells them of the situation. The next morning, 3 pilots, including himself, would take off in the 3 combat-ready Kitty Hawks to attack the incoming convoy. This was all of the aircraft that No. 75 Squadron had left. He asked for volunteers from the fitters and armourers and mechanics. Almost all of them volunteered. All of the pilots volunteered, so they ended up drawing straws, and Michael Butler and Peter Masters were selected. The 200 others of the squadron headed to the docks where they boarded the Taruna, which was waiting to take them back to Australia. That night, Jackson and Dean Butcher sat down at the beach and drank beers. In the morning, Jackson would lead the other two pilots on their strike mission, whilst Dean Butcher would lead the ground crew up to Warrawoona Falls up in the hills. Les and the doc grabbed some chairs and some beers and sat down at the beach for a couple of quiet drinks whilst they contemplated the perilous mission that was awaiting them the next morning. The next morning, as the sun came above the horizon, they were officially informed that the Japanese invasion fleet was not going to be attacking Port Moresby. The next morning, the three Kitty Hawks would escort 4 United States Dauntless dive bombers from Port Moresby to Horn Island on their way to Townsville. It's important to remember that these aircraft weren't the only RAA aircraft on operations at the time. The Catalina flying boats were doing a sterling work in the reconnaissance role. And of course, they were supported by American aircraft, which were becoming available in increasing numbers. However, as we've seen with No. 75 Squadron, there were some issues with the early deployments of some of these squadrons. The US Army Air Force 8th Bombardment Squadron, which was equipped with Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, a slow and underpowered aircraft, but could work well in the carrier role. But without fighter escorts, it was easy prey for the Japanese. So on the 31st of March, 13 aircraft took off from Charters Towers for Port Moresby. 3 returned due to excess oil consumption, 2 bogged in mud. They hadn't been briefed at what time the local sunset was for the Port Moresby airfield, so they arrived after dark. They hadn't been briefed that 300 metres of the runway at 7 Mile Drome was still under construction, and there was construction equipment on the runway, which 2 aircraft crashed into, and several had violent ground loops in avoiding the obstruction. This left just 6 out of the original 13 aircraft that had taken off that morning. Interestingly enough, though, the logistics for this squadron was so poor that the aircraft flew with their own bombs to Port Moresby. This was a forbidden practice and could have ended in disaster for the aircraft that had crashed into the construction equipment on the runway. On the 20th of April, 15 P-39 Aerocobras of the US 8th Fighter Group's 35th Squadron took off from Cairns for Horn Island as the start of their deployment into New Guinea. They ran into dark weather, radio communications broke down, and some returned to Cooktown, but some tried to get through the storm. In all, 11 out of the 15 ran out of fuel and crash-landed. All but 2 of the pilots lived. Those 2 went missing somewhere near Cape Grenville. So we can see the difficulties here just in these staging flights, let alone getting ready for combat against experienced Japanese pilots in very good aircraft. Of course, this would be just the start of the great build-up of the US Army Air Force, which would be able to deploy into the AO in prodigious numbers as the war went on. The operations record book for No. 75 Squadron for April states that the squadron had done 638 hours of flying, 177 of them air fighting. It had 10 aircraft left, 3 of them serviceable, 7 of them not. And in total it had 211 officers and men. It's important to remember that for 44 days, since the 21st of March, it was only No. 75 Squadron that was defending Port Moresby. Mark Johnston, in his book Whispering Death, discusses the assessment of the intelligence officer, Flight Lieutenant Colley. He writes, Colley summarised the unit's claims between the 21st of March and the 3rd of May as 18 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, 17 on the ground, with a further 4 probables in the air and 47 damaged in the air or on the ground. In turn, he said the unit lost 15 in the air and 2 on the ground. 5 others were written off in accidents. Of the 37 pilots who served in the squadron in this period, 11 were killed in aerial combat, as well as squadron leader Creswell, and another was killed in an accident. While the claims of the kills were, as in every Air Force, exaggerated, Japanese figures for Rabaul, Lae and Salamoa between the 1st of April and 3rd of May indicate that 34 Japanese aircraft were damaged in air combat and a further 8 hit by anti-aircraft fire. 12 were lost in the air, with another 10 destroyed or badly damaged on the ground. 50 were less badly damaged. The sole Australian fighter squadron in New Guinea had contributed significantly to these Japanese losses. Theirs was a remarkable effort, especially given the unit's pilot strength in the period probably averaged between 7 and 12, and it rarely had more than 5 or 6 aircraft serviceable at any one time. On the other hand, the Japanese bomber strength, about 24 aircraft at Rabaul, may have been insufficient to damage irreparably the facilities at Port Moresby. It's important not to just discuss what happened in the air, but also what happened on the ground. So here's a little snippet from Arthur Tucker again. He is talking about the issues that they were having from a health perspective.
The labour force had intense gastroenteritis there in November the previous year. This was probably the outstanding impression I have of the Battle of Milne, is that we all got it. I've told you, I've got shits ended in my logbook with my first combat. That wasn't fear, that was the fact that it was trickling down my legs because I had gastroenteritis. They were feeding us on tin bacon, which was dreadful, tropical spread, which was worse, baked beans, and somewhere or other they'd captured one of those Liberty ships full of goldfish, what do you call them, herrings and tomato sauce. And that was what we were supposed to eat. Now the baked beans would blow up in your stomach. You already had gastroenteritis, and so there was nowhere to wash your clothes. So you'd take a spare pair of shorts down to the strip, and when you landed, you'd clean your aeroplane up, wash your shorts, put your other wet ones on, and so we lived in wet clothes. And this is no exaggeration. Now the other thing is that despite that, there were no latrine trenches dug, and so our only hygiene was a shovel and a roll of paper in the nearby Kunai around where we had to be on standby from before dawn till after dark. Now this is no exaggeration, that is the truth. And so we were nearly defeated by gastroenteritis. We were all suffering acute gastroenteritis the whole time.
So very poor living conditions, not only for the pilots, but for all of the members of Number 75 Squadron. Rudimentary cooking facilities. This is why there was a significant amount of dysentery. We also see a lot of malaria. There was no insect repellent, no quinine, very short supplies of Adabrin, and all of the personnel were in shorts and short-sleeve shirts, which is exactly what you don't want to be wearing when you're in a malarial area. The maintenance facilities were rudimentary as well, and I've heard multiple references of the pilots talking about the aircraft maintainers working miracles to get battle-damaged or planes with maintenance issues back into the air to continue the fight. One interesting issue that was raised by Flight Lieutenant William Matson, who was one of the aircraft maintainers, he spoke about the fact that there were no replacement bulbs for the illuminated reflector gun sight. It puts an illuminated sight on a piece of glass that reflects. This reduces the parallax error as the pilot moves their head around in the cockpit. Without it, pilots are reduced to firing their guns and then adjusting where they see their traces go. Not only is it much less accurate, but it also alerts the enemy pilot that they are being stalked. Matson believes that the lack of replacement bulbs for the sights could have reduced the effectiveness of the pilots by 50%, i.e. if they'd had replacement bulbs, they could have got twice as many kills. Such a simple logistics issue, such a large decrease in capability. One of the other issues that the pilots at Port Moresby had was insufficient warning time. This meant that they weren't able to climb to be above the Japanese attackers before they had arrived at Port Moresby. However, it's important to remember that they were getting some warning time, and a lot of this was down to the work of Flight Lieutenant Lee Vile. Before the war, Lee had been a patrol officer in the mandated territory of New Guinea Public Service. He married Marjorie Strangwood in 1936 in Salamoa, a beautiful place to get married. He would live near Finchhafen and in Salamoa before the war, before being promoted to Assistant District Officer for Rowell in 1940. With the fall of Rowell, his wife and children were evacuated back to Melbourne, and he set up in Salamoa. He began work as a coast watcher with the Allied Intelligence Bureau. He set up on a hill where he was able to view the airfields at both Salamoa and at Lae. His calm, clear transmissions of Japanese activity at both of these airfields gave him the name of Golden Voice. He served as a coast watcher for 6 months, then, whilst on leave, wrote a book on jungle survival. Then he joined the Far East Liaison Office, where he was a driving force in the development of propaganda leaflets. For his work, he was awarded the United States Distinguished Service Cross in 1942. On the 30th of April 1943, he was killed when the US Liberator aircraft that he was overseeing supply drops from crashed into mountainous terrain near Bina Bina. Flight Lieutenant Weil, along with the other coast watchers, formed a network of early warning stations that enabled the fighters of No. 75 Squadron to at least be in the air before the Japanese attacked on many occasions. So, where was No. 75 Squadron during the Battle of Isirava? Well, I'm glad you asked. After they left Port Moresby, they went to Kingaroy in Queensland, where they could rest, refit, and be equipped with new P-40s. From there, they would head to Milne Bay. Milne Bay is located at the eastern end of Papua New Guinea, about 400 kilometres as the Kitty Hawk flies. They would be led by Les Jackson. 75 Squadron would be joined by its sister squadron, No. 76 Squadron. That would be led by Peter Turnbull until he was killed, and he would be replaced with Bluey Truscott. They would also be supported by B-25s, B-26s and B-17s from the US 5th Air Force. The Japanese would land almost 2,000 troops and 2 tanks at Milne Bay. They would be opposed by over 8,500 Allied troops, almost all of them Australian. The Japanese had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the enemy forces by an order of magnitude. It wasn't just a couple of companies guarding the decisive terrain at Milne Bay. That decisive terrain was the airfields that were being built. Even before the battle had begun, air power was starting to have its presence felt. At 8:30 on the 24th of August, an RAAF Hudson bomber provided early warning of a Japanese landing convoy making its way towards Milne Bay. A second convoy, consisting of 7 barges, was also spotted. In response to that, 12 RAAF Kitty Hawks were scrambled at midday. They spotted the 7 barges off Goodenough Island, which had just landed 350 troops on the island so that they could rest in preparation for their landing. These troops had been planning on landing in Goodenough Bay, crossing the Stirling Ranges, and then attacking the Australian troops from the north. However, the RAAF Kitty Hawks sunk all of the barges, stranding them on Goodenough Island. The main landing convoy was subjected to multiple maritime strike raids. However, only limited damage was done to it. And at 22:30 on the 25th of August, they were able to land over 1,000 men and the 2 Type 95 Hargo tanks. On dawn of the 26th of August, the lead elements of the Japanese were in contact with Bravo Company 61st Infantry Battalion around KB Mission. The beachhead area, where much of the Japanese supplies were stored, was subjected to repeated heavy attacks by RAAF Kitty Hawks and B-25s, B-26s and B-17s. A large quantity of supplies were destroyed and a number of landing barges that had been beached near KB Mission. These landing barges were going to have been used by the Japanese to outflank successive Allied positions. The RAAF was able to gain air superiority over Milne Bay, with Japanese fighters that were meant to be providing top cover being shot down as they took off from Buna. The Japanese fought ferociously to take the newly developed airfields, but the Australian defenders were able to hold them back. This enabled the Kitty Hawks of 75 and 76 Squadron to provide close air support to the troops, often whilst they were in contact. During the week-long battle, the two squadrons would fire 196,000 rounds of 50 cal ammunition, and they wore out 300 gun barrels against ground targets and the landing craft. This had a huge impact on the morale of the Japanese, who were unable to move out from beneath the jungle canopy during the day. At one point, the army requested that the palm trees surrounding them be raked with fire for hidden Japanese snipers. After the mission, the pilots were told that palm fronds, bullets, and dead Japanese snipers were pouring down with the rain. On the 5th of September, the Japanese would withdraw from Milne Bay. Mark Johnson, in Whispering Death, records how Lieutenant General Sid Rowell, the commander of New Guinea Force, and Major General Cyril Clowes, the commander of Milne Force, described the impact of the RAAF on the combat. Lieutenant General Rowell said the decisive factor was probably the action of 75 and 76 Squadrons RAAF on the first day. General Clowes used the same phrase in saying that the Kitty Hawk Squadron's incessant attacks over 3 successive days proved the decisive factor. If we look at the Air Power Manual, the capstone document for RAAF doctrine, it speaks that the 4 core air power roles and their associated missions are A. Control of the air, offensive counter-air and defensive counter-air. B. Strike, strategic attack, close air support, air interdiction, anti-surface warfare, anti-submarine warfare, electronic warfare, and information operations. C. Air mobility, air logistics support, airborne operations, air-to-air refueling, and aeromedical evacuation. And D. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. During the Battle of Milne Bay, we see all 4 of those roles being conducted: control of the air, strike, air mobility, and ISR. So now we come to the analysis of the effectiveness of air power in the Kokoda Campaign. As the Australian troops are winning their victory at Milne Bay, and it's important to remember that the victory at Milne Bay was the first time that the Japanese had been decisively defeated. They were forced to withdraw. But at the same time that this was going on, Maroubra Force is conducting a desperate withdrawal. Their requests for air support go unanswered. Now, to conduct this analysis, I don't think we need to go down the track of what if. We should be asking the more important question of why not. So there are some terrain differences between Milne Bay and the Kokoda track. However, the opportunities to strike at the Japanese were manifest. The Japanese had a long supply line and they made no efforts to hide it. And in fact, Australian troops could see in some places Japanese moving at night by lanterns. Buna and Gona were significant logistics bases which could have been interdicted, but weren't. Indeed, the convoy, as it was moving towards Buna and Gona for that initial landing, could have been detected by ISR, could have been destroyed by maritime strike. But there simply wasn't enough assets to be able to conduct 2 battles simultaneously. Number 75 Squadron, on its first deployment to Port Moresby, had fought itself to exhaustion. There was only one squadron that could be ready in time to defend Port Moresby. And the training of many of the pilots who flew in the squadron at that time simply wasn't good enough. What we see here is the Japanese temporal dislocation of the RAAF. The RAAF is mobilising, but at the point of contact, it is delivering too little, too late. We've seen the difficulties in mobilisation in the 53rd Battalion. The difficulties in mobilisation for an Air Force are much greater because of the equipment and training liabilities. Having said that, the RAAF was formed in 1921 to defend Australia, primarily from Japan. When war came in 1939, it found itself without two feathers to fly with. Even then, there was still plenty of time to mobilise. It was 900 days from Menzies' declaration of war to the bombing of Darwin, and yet, when the Japanese were able to strike at the Australian continent, there was no RAAF fighter squadrons to defend it. When some fighters were finally available to defend Darwin, they were American fighters. When Australia finally deployed a fighter squadron to Port Moresby to defend it, remember that was still Australian territory technically, they would do so in P-40 Kitty Hawks that had been given to them by the Americans because they were no longer required for the defence of the Dutch East Indies. Australia had botched the procurement of airframes that would be capable of defending the country. The Empire Air Training Scheme compounded the mistakes. It provided a huge contribution to the capability of the RAF. 10,500 Australian pilots were trained in that scheme. And yet many went to RAF squadrons, and many of them were unable to come back to Australia to defend the nation when they were needed. The pilots of No. 75 Squadron paid the price of these mistakes, with a high number of casualties from accidents and combat losses where junior pilots were flying in an inferior aircraft against highly skilled Japanese pilots in a much better aircraft. As we think about the pilots of No. 75 Squadron, cast a thought for the pilots of No. 1 and No. 8 Squadrons with their Hudsons in Malaya, and No. 21 and No. 453 Squadron with their Brewster Buffaloes in Malaya and Singapore. The Brewster Buffalo, which was described by one of its pilots as an apology for an aircraft. It's important to remember that their combat happened only 8 months prior to the combat at Milne Bay. We're shortly going to do an episode looking at the development of Canungra and jungle doctrine for the Army. This is the same story as we see currently at this point of the war. The RAAF doesn't have the operational training units. These are the units where a pilot will learn to fly the type that they're going to fly in combat, and they're going to learn and practice the tactics that they're going to use in combat. What we've learned is that the generation of air capability takes time, equipment, training, and doctrine. It wasn't a surprise that the Japanese would attack and threaten Australia. It was a surprise that they were able to do so quickly. However, the fallacy of the Singapore strategy had been known for decades. It's true that Australia was struggling with the economic impact of the Great Depression. However, the Japanese were able to develop their naval and air capabilities, and they were doing that in plain sight. It was on display in combat in China. The warning signs were there. The lessons in the changing character of war were there for anyone who wanted to see them. Sadly, for the brave pilots of the RAAF, those lessons were slow in coming, and the impact of the delay would be profound. We'll leave it here. We're going to be shortly looking at the strategic level because I really do want to drill into how poorly not just the Army, not just the Air Force, but also the Navy were prepared for combat against the Japanese. Next week, we'll take a break from the Kokoda Campaign series and look at lessons learned from UAS combat in Ukraine.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.